to the official part of the of today's session, and I'm going to hand over to Michelle, who will open. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, thanks Angela, and welcome everyone. Let me start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land. Where I am, it's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And if we do have any First Nations people on the call, I pay my respects to you. Thank you for joining us. Welcome, I'm Michelle Higelin. I'm the Executive Director of ActionAid. Delighted to welcome you to our Women Leading Climate Action Speaker Series, which is organised jointly by ActionAid Australia and Women's Agenda. This is designed to lift diverse women's voices in Australia and overseas on solutions to the climate crisis. And I think a few of us need a reminder that it was really this time last year where devastating bushfires ravaged across the country with lasting impacts on families and communities here in Australia. We're obviously seeing a similar thing in the US at the moment. And also right now as we meet, in Southern Africa, millions of people face a hunger crisis due to prolonged drought, climate-related shocks, and now intersecting with both COVID-19 and an economic recession. This year, we also saw Bangladesh submerged underwater, with a third of the country underwater as a result of devastating floods, and 1.5 million people left displaced. All the while, we do continue to have a government that is moving further away from the Paris commitments to limit global warming. We heard last month the Prime Minister announced that it may take Australia up until midway through the next half of the century to reach zero emissions. From our perspective, it's simply not good enough. So today we're here to start to continue the conversation around how we can take urgent climate action, with a particular focus on what's driving climate denial and inaction, and looking at ways that we can harness media and technology to drive urgent action. For those of you who are new to ActionAid, we're a global women's rights organisation working in over 45 countries to end poverty and injustice. We support women on the front lines of the climate crisis around the world, while also campaigning here in Australia for urgent climate action, as we know that climate change is having devastating impacts on women living in poverty around the world. We're really proud to be partnering with Women's Agenda for this series. And for those of you who are new to Women's Agenda, it aims to get more women's voices heard on the issues that matter. And with that, I'd like to pass over to Angela Priestley, who's going to moderate today's discussion and introduce our three amazing speakers.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And thank you everybody for joining us for the next of this Women Leading Climate Action series. As I mentioned a few minutes prior to when we were supposed to start, if you do want to let us know where you're tuning in from today, please do. You can let us know what's going on in the background. Also, any comments or thoughts that you have on the discussion, and of course, any questions as well, which we'll try to get to towards the latter part of the hour. So just a few quick thoughts on today's topic from my perspective. One thing that I think we can really say is that fake news, denialism, misinformation, it seems to get particularly bad in the midst of a crisis at a country's most vulnerable, I think, or at a situation's most vulnerable. And we see that with COVID-19. We saw it during the bushfire crisis in Australia, where a targeted and coordinated online campaign was found to be promoting the now debunked claim that arson was the main cause of the fires. You might remember the arson emergency hashtag, which the University of Queensland has since found was largely pushed by Twitter accounts created by bots and trolls. You can go and check out some of their research. Sadly, we're seeing the same thing happening in California, where fake news is spreading, also largely by bots and anonymous accounts. And they're saying everything from that hundreds of arsonists have been arrested to that the fires have been started by environmental activists, among other bits and pieces of misinformation that's being spread there. So just always to keep in mind that this stuff is happening when we're at our most vulnerable. So it happens, in the eye of the storm, but unfortunately also we know that misinformation, fake news, it's been working to impact how we understand or how we think we understand climate change for decades. And fake news, of course, can easily spread across major social platforms, but misinformation also comes from our mainstream media, and it can be pushed by a centralized agenda, and it can be peddled by key and very popular newspaper columnists. Fake news can make front page news. It can be later debunked, but by that point, it can be too late. Its headlines have been viewed by, those who see just the front of the newspaper, who may never actually get into the depths of the story, who may never actually see any kind of corrections come through, who may never actually see the full part of the story. Those headlines can be enough and they can stick with you. So it's all obviously a real problem, and I dare suggest that it's also a big part of why we're in a lot of the mess that we're in. So we want to talk about it, and a little later we're going to learn a little more about what can be done about it, and to particularly have a look in what's going on in the Pacific, where women have created their own weather network, which we've spoken a little bit before on this series, but it is really exciting, and it's something to really keep in mind as an idea of what can be done. And of course, there's also lots of things that we can do here and are being done in Australia too. So to welcome our panel, and I think we have lost part of the panel. So there's three of us online at the moment. Michelle will come back towards the end of the conversation, and Sharon's back there. So I'll start just introducing just a little brief bio on each of our speakers. So Denise Shrivell, MediaScope advisor. How are you, Denise?
Well, thanks.
Joining us from Sydney.
Yes.
You've been actively involved in the advertising, media and publishing industry in Australia and overseas for more than 30 years. Denise now runs MediaScope and is a leading commentator on issues such as Australia's internet and its impact, the media ownership landscape and ethical advertising. She has a particular interest in the spread of false information through social media platforms. And if you follow Denise on Twitter, you also know that she is extremely active on Twitter. So thank you for joining us, Denise. We've also got Belinda Xie here. Belinda, joining us from Canberra, I believe.
No, I'm also in Sydney, actually. Also in
Sydney, sorry. Okay, Belinda. Belinda is a third-year PhD student in the School of Psychology at UNSW with a PhD research. Her PhD research primarily explores how people reason with evidence, specifically in relation to climate change. Her research will use insights from the cognitive and decision sciences field to improve the way we understand climate change and solutions. And Belinda will use those findings for her research to inform climate change solutions. So in a minute, we're going to hear a little bit about why Belinda chose that. And joining us also Sharon Bhagwan Rolls. Sharon is a second generation Fiji Island feminist, working on the intersection of gender, media communications and peace. She's currently a technical advisor to the Shifting the Power Coalition, which supports women's leadership in responding to climate change and disasters. Following a career in mainstream broadcasting, she co-founded FemLink Pacific and pioneered women's weather work, supporting climate action through SMS communication platforms. Thank you for joining us, Sharon. And maybe let us know, I believe you're in the middle of a meeting going on.
Yeah. So I'm actually with humans in Suva, but it's really interesting because in terms of this topic, the conference or the conversation is actually talking about the impact of climate change on migration or relocation in local communities in the Pacific with a focus on Fiji. So very pertinent to be having this conversation, but thank you also for this opportunity to join your conversation today.
Great, thank you. It's so good to have you here, and thank you obviously for taking the time out from that session too. So Belinda, I might just start with you first, just because I know that some of your research will be able to sort of put together a bit of a framework of this discussion, I guess. So why did you choose this area to focus on, and what were some of your initial concerns? And I might come to your latest project a little later, but first, what can you tell us about misinformation research more generally?
Sure. So I first decided to look at this intersection between climate change and decision making. Firstly, because I was very personally concerned about climate change and its impacts. And secondly, I think decision making and psychology in general has a lot of insights to offer that can help us understand why we aren't acting to the extent that we should be. So to elaborate on that a bit more, I think most people here would understand that taking action on climate is not just a function of how much scientific knowledge people have. Taking action on climate becomes a political issue because it relates to people's values and their sense of identity. It's a social issue because it depends on what the people around us are doing. And then it's a cognitive issue because it depends on what information we're exposed to, how we interpret that information, how we use that information to make decisions. So fortunately, psychology has studied these things like values and social norms and decision making for many decades, and so we understand fairly well how these processes happen. So in terms of climate change and misinformation, misinformation, maybe I'll start with a quick definition, is just inaccurate or false information that may or may not be intended to deceive. So what we know from research in misinformation generally is that once people are exposed to misinformation, it can be really difficult to later correct those incorrect beliefs. So like you were saying, Angela, people will see a headline and they may not look any further, and that can influence their decision-making and actions for a long time. So there's actually a name for that we use called the continued influence effect. So it's misinformation continuing to influence decision-making and actions, even if that misinformation was actually corrected or shown to be false. And the reason that is the case is because misinformation serves a purpose. For example, the arson emergency with the bushfire crisis, that helps to explain to people why the bushfires are happening. So people can start to make sense of their world and understand what's going on. When you tell people that actually arson isn't involved, they're then left with a gap in their knowledge, and that makes decision-making and reasoning really difficult. And so sometimes people still cling to that misinformation, and those incorrect beliefs can remain really sticky for a long time.
Wow. Okay. Can you just remind me of that term that you used again? It was a continued
influence effect.
Okay, that is,
yes.
I mean, that is really interesting. And again, that may not be an intended response to that either, because it's, if you're not, and this also you feel a sense a lot, is that people can tune out from the news, and they can do that for all sorts of reasons. And, you know, that's fine. You can understand people wanting to do that, particularly when the news is difficult, which it has been, frankly, this year, obviously. And so that's where it's not necessarily an intended response to that, to want to tune out and not go and get the further information. It could be because they don't get an opportunity. It could be because they don't delve into the news. It could be because they never actually read that section or that piece or go into those topics.
Yeah, so there's a lot of reasons why people won't engage perhaps as much as we want them to. The first thing that comes to mind is misinformation can sometimes fit in really well with what people already believe and their existing worldviews. And when that happens, there's no reason at all for people to question it or challenge it any further. The other tricky thing with misinformation is that misinformation is often designed to be very simple and compelling, whereas what we would think of as evidence-based information is often very complicated, and it takes longer to work through the alternative explanation there. People prefer simplicity if all other things remain constant. And so that's another way that misinformation can be unchallenged. Yeah.
Can I ask you, I don't know if your research has gone specifically into this, because I know that I just brought it up as an example, but going back to, say, arson emergency, that hashtag, I guess if I was looking at that, I mean, I was thinking about that, and I remember that happening. And I guess my initial thought was somebody said it, it just got repeated. I never thought that it could have been a bigger campaign. Do you know much about it, where it came from, or what we know so far about it? Was it just that somebody started talking about it, or was it quite a deliberate act of misinformation at some point? Because we talk about, you know, some of this research that found that a lot of bots started repeating it.
Yeah, sorry, I think my internet might not be so good. I didn't quite catch all of that, but I am not too sure about exactly how that started. Perhaps Denise will know, but I know actually my PhD, apart from the climate change, I look at how repetitions affect people's reasoning. And we know that repetitions have a disproportionate impact on people's judgments. Often people don't realize that things have been repeated, but they still think that the evidence becomes stronger just because it has been repeated and becomes more familiar and more fluent in their minds. So in that way, the actions of those bots was very damaging.
Okay. All right, Denise, I will go to you now. So I know that you've been very open online about experiencing, I guess, a major turning point in how you vote and engage on issues since moving to get your information more independently. So to get your information yourself, to use Twitter for that information, to follow certain things, and I imagine also to follow set press conferences and policies as they release yourself, as opposed to getting it from other sources. What can happen, do you think, if someone relies on traditional media sources or only certain media sources, particularly when it comes to climate change?
Well, my overall concern is that when someone relies only on traditional media, they can become misinformed. And then they can vote against their own best interests on a huge range of issues. And right now, there's perhaps no greater issue facing us than climate change. Prior to my own turning point, which you mentioned, Angela, I considered myself to be quite politically informed. I took voting very seriously. I wanted to make good decisions for myself, my family, and my community in the voting box. And as I worked in the media, I trusted that the media was going to inform me to make those good decisions. Increasingly, I started to notice a mismatch between what I was seeing in the mainstream to what I was seeing experts speak about, particularly on Twitter and other social media platforms. So it seemed to me the more politically engaged I became through the Twitter community, and it is a community, it's a community full of experts, scientists, academics, long-time politically informed people. The more informed I became through that community, the less I was trusting the information that I was seeing through mainstream media sources.
Denise, can I just stop you there for a moment? I mean, I know that I've had this, this question has come through from Simon, and it is something that I often think about as well, and that is that there is a gap between those who are on Twitter and those who aren't, because a lot of people are not on Twitter, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I myself go and have like long stints where I kind of move away from Twitter because I actually can find it quite a negative space and not always in my best interest to be there. So when you say community, I guess my worry would be then it's a community sharing that information amongst themselves. And so how does that community then ensure that that information can get out to a wider audience, I guess? Do you ever get concerned that, and I've heard this analogy of also it being like a hall of mirrors where you can get ideas that just reflect back to yourself. And so that might be happening in a good way if you've got lots of expertise and experts and scientists out there, but it also is happening in the other way if you're in a community that doesn't have that going on, or is in a community that is engaging perhaps more with the misinformation.
We often hear that about the Twitter community, and I do regard it as a community. Like, it is a really large and very active and engaged group of people who are really interested in a huge range of issues. Climate change is just one of the issues. But, you know, as an example today, of course, we'll be talking a lot about the budget. I'm very careful about how I've curated and managed that community that I'm a part of. There are an enormous amount of experts that you can tap into, and they're also within this community. I really rely on them to get a lot of the information. There's a lot of independent journalists also part of that community that share their views, that obviously point to their articles. But yes, in regard to the bubble thing, there's another way that I look at it also is I live in Sydney's North Shore. In some ways, I'm leaving my lived experience bubble and moving to another kind of bubble where I'm getting to know the views of people from all over the world and all over Australia that is very much outside of my own personal lived experience. So even though, yes, we're perhaps in a community of people sharing all kinds of information from all kinds of lived experiences, all kinds of locations around the world and around Australia, I find it a very active and quite broad community. But to me, the basis of what we talk about has to be grounded in factual information. And that's really what I try and aim for.
Okay, great. I think maybe as we send out notes from this webinar, it might be a good idea if we put together a list of, and I've got some of these myself, and I'm sure that Denise, Belinda, you'll have some, and Sharon as well. We might share some just interesting people to follow on these topics, especially. I mean, one thing, Denise, that comes to mind when we talk about expertise is how, when I look at we've obviously had a lot of talk on Australia's gas-led recovery, and I've found that Twitter particularly has been a good place for me to go and to actually go and hear from energy experts there and get differing opinions and about that I might not actually be getting if I just kept to more traditional media sources. So I found that particularly useful. And I might add there's lots of really fascinating, interesting women in the climate science space, and a diverse range of women in the climate science space, which I think would be great for us to start getting a list. Sharon, I do want to get back to you in a moment. How fake news is impacting our ability to take action. Now, I know that you've been waiting patiently, but how does a lack of action, in places like Australia, how do you women on the front lines of climate?
Okay, so I think I'm hearing you.
Can you hang on? Did you hear that, Sharon?
Okay, so I think and what? Yep. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I might just actually put my video off because that's one of the challenges here is because of the internet.
Okay.
Sorry, give me 1 second. Right, so I think first of all, I just want to acknowledge that as Pacific Island people, we're people both of the land and the sea. And quite often, the Pacific Island is just portrayed for tourism postcards, so to speak. But the majority of the news is actually avoiding the stories of the impact of rising sea levels, and that loss and damage is the loss of livelihoods, culture, including indigenous sites, food gardens, indigenous homes, traditional homes, and of course identity. And within that loss is the loss of dignity of communities. And within that whole conversation is also the further marginalization of women as the victims, or as seen as project beneficiaries in terms of climate change projects. So one of the things, can you hear me?
Well, Sharon, sorry, it's really hard. I think the background, because I know that obviously it's you obviously need to be. Is there anything?
I'm actually outside and people are on morning tea break, so I can't really go anywhere else at the moment. So what I'll try to do is, I can't find a place that's a little quieter, so maybe we could.
Okay, so we've got, so Sharon's just dropped out. I think she's gone to find a quieter location potentially. Now, one thing we do have, we actually have, Sharon sent a video. So I won't play that now, but again, in the notes that we'll send through afterwards, it's a really good video. And I was actually taking notes on it earlier and I wish I had those with me right now because I'd be able to share some of those, but we'll definitely send that. And also if it is that there's a morning tea break going on in the background, we may actually find that we can go back to Sharon a little bit later in the conversation, depending on how long the morning tea break goes for. But in the meantime, Belinda, I might go back to you just regarding that question that I guess was next on my list. It was how you see fake news impacting our ability to take collective action on climate change. I think Belinda, sorry, Belinda, sorry. That question was actually, I'm completely, sorry. I've been cut off because we've lost a panelist. But Denise, I actually wanted to ask you that question, was looking at how that lack of, how fake news might be impacting, particularly here in Australia, our ability to take action on climate change. And then Belinda, after this, I will go to you because this has come up in the questions regarding how fake news and misinformation might be politicized. And if you've seen any differences or if this is part of your research, how it's happening in Australia compared to say what's going on in different parts of Europe. So Denise, firstly to you.
In regard to collective action, so I think there's no greater collective action than what we do in the voting box at 3 levels of government, so local, state and federal, particularly in Australia where we're one of a handful of countries that has compulsory voting. Put the layer on top of that we also have the most concentrated media ownership landscape out of all democratic countries in the world. We have media owners who have quite a declared position on climate change, and of course editors and journalists also with quite strong political alignments. I think it makes us very vulnerable to misinformation, again on a huge range of issues, but particularly climate change. I think that this impacts the success of collective action at all levels. So whether that be through getting people to join community-led actions, joining protests, or indeed the most important collective action that we as citizens of Australia can undertake, and that's in the voting box. My concern again is that often because of this misinformation, we're voting on a media owner's best interests instead of our own best interests.
Okay. So Belinda, can I ask you now then, since I guess we are moving now a little bit into the politicisation of this topic that goes on, have you noticed any differences here in Australia compared to, say, Europe? And I have to say, like, when I look at, other parts of the world are talking about a green-led recovery, and we don't use that term in Australia at all. We're using a gas-led recovery. Why is it so difficult for us to talk in those ways, as it's been a lot simpler for other parts of the world to use COVID as really a reset opportunity when it comes to climate policies?
Yeah, so I think it relates a lot to what Denise has just said about media ownership. And there is some research that singles Australia out in terms of all the conservative governments in the world. Australia is particularly stubborn when it comes to implementing climate change solutions. Usually conservative governments are sort of quite happy with market-based interventions so for example, like the carbon price, but which is something I think that the UK and other European countries that appear to be making more progress are more comfortable with, but Australia still refuses to consider that possibility. So to answer Sue's question a bit more about the differences between UK and Australia, I think the individuals that make up UK and Australia are actually more similar than you might expect. So for example, in the latest research project that I was involved in, we were looking at the different factors that impact how bad Australians think climate change is and how willing they are to do something about it. And the framework that we used was actually taken from a UK study that did the same thing with the UK population. And we found quite remarkable similarities. So the factors that are influencing individuals in both of these countries are quite similar, but perhaps there are these sort of more systemic, broader factors like media and politics that are having a larger influence on our climate outcomes.
Okay. All right. So we also have, so I can see that Sharon is back online. I don't know, Sharon, if you can turn on your speaker. Okay. We can hear you.
How does this sound? Hopefully it's a lot better. Is this a lot better for you?
You were sharing some idea of your experiences. We're talking about in the Pacific impact.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think in terms of the representation of women, globally, we know that women are underrepresented, and the evidence is there in terms of the Global Media Monitoring Project, and that is just being updated at the moment. I think the other issue also is in terms of the power and ownership of the media and the way in which the influence around, this whole notion of fake news comes back to me to ask the question, who's determining content? And from my vantage point as a Pacific Island woman, I see a lot of the Australian content in particular, but the content also from the global south coming from a very industrialized perspective. It comes, so it does need to better unpack. For me, the media needs to get better at looking at, greater independent sources as well. Obviously, fact-checking is important. Part of the work we're starting to do is the Shifting the Power Coalition is to also better inform ourselves and understand climate science as well and use that in our advocacy. But it comes back to power, and I kind of equate it in terms of this bigger notion in terms of not just climate change, but also what it's doing to Pacific Island communities and our own notions of security. So it starts to talk about the fact that it is a reality. We're living with this climate crisis. COVID-19 has come on top of the climate crisis in the Pacific and in other regions of the world as well, not just the Pacific. The climate crisis is affecting people's very sense of identity, our notions of our tradition and our history. And this is not just an issue for Pacific Island countries in Australia's big backyard, but the issue of bushfires is clearly something that's affected the farming community in Australia. There are coastal communities in the northern part of Australia who, you know, rely on mangrove swamps, who rely on the ocean as well. And I think as we look at the climate crisis, we need to get better at reporting these stories. So, you know, as a broadcaster myself, as somebody that's come out of the media, it's just so important that we are listening to the communities, we're understanding what is the impact that's, you know, that is taking place in their lives, not just today, but actually we're talking about the future generations. We're talking about, you know, the future of our island countries as well. I'll pause there. Thank you.
Yes, I think that's so important. And I think you've just given us an idea for a new feature series there, Sharon. But I think, like, to hear the stories about people who are being impacted right now. And I can't help but think of Paddy Manning has this excellent book out, who's a journalist here in Australia. And I encourage you all to go check it out. It's called Body Count. So it has got a very confronting title, but he goes and talks to direct family members of people who have been impacted by the climate crisis, who have lost a loved one to you know, some impact of the climate crisis. And it's really compelling reading. I think that we might be lacking a little bit of that, and that's part of, I think, maybe even the issue around talking about climate change. And I noticed that there's a comment here from Chantel, which I think is really relevant, and that is that just the term climate change can be part of the problem, that, you know, that we sort of, and I hear this a bit, that maybe all along there's been a bit of a PR issue with the way that we talk about this. But, you know, if we need to look at, you know, the climate crisis. She's talking about being a volunteer for a grassroots 350 group in Australia for a few years, that they use climate crisis or climate emergency because it changes the way that people think about and puts it into context that we need to act urgently. And I think that that's really important. I've noticed that shift occurring a little bit on social media in the places where I am, around, you know, talking about the climate crisis, talking about the climate emergency, talking about this being that it is impacting us right now. It has been on our doorstep. It is on our doorstep on the Pacific, but it is in our country as well here in Australia. And so this is the thing, we need to get on top of this now. We can't think of it as some slow moving thing that we can put off into the future, because we've been doing that for far too long. So Belinda, I might go back to you now. So your latest research project aims to identify the psychological factors that influence, firstly, how bad Australians think climate change is, and second, how willing Australians are to do something about it. What did you see in terms of the effects of misinformation on these factors?
We were able to see a huge effect of misinformation on both of these factors. So this research project involved measuring a lot of different variables within individuals. So these were variables that previous research had identified as being the most influential in shaping how people think and act on climate. And this is across different countries and over some period of time. So these included variables like age, the political party you tend to vote for, the social norms around you, whether you'd experienced any extreme weather events yourself or not, and how much knowledge you have about climate change, the causes, the impacts, and the solutions. So we were able to sort of rank these different variables in terms of how influential they were for shaping Australians' beliefs. And we found that the most important variable was generally how people feel about climate change. So the more they worry it, the more we think, like, vote for a party with strong climate policy, donate to environmental organisations, pay more for green energy. But the second most important factor out of almost 20 was people's beliefs in these misinformation arguments that are really common in Australian media. So agreeing with statements like nothing Australia does can make a difference, we don't have to take action because technologies will save us. So basically what this means is that from the way that we measure things in psychology, misinformation is one of the biggest barriers preventing individual Australians from taking action.
Wow. Okay. And that misinformation, I mean, that's just, it comes in huge different forms there.
Yeah.
I recall reading even, Michael Mann's got a great book on this as well. And he makes that comment about how, or even when people make those comments, oh, if this is climate change, I'll take it. When the weather feels a little bit warmer in winter or something, people use all these things almost to justify or minimize it, or even make a joke of what's going on. Going back to the terms around climate change, a few more comments. So Sharon has also mentioned climate justice, which is an excellent, I love that. That works really well. Gemma notes it about a cautionary note from experts against using terminology that could provoke fear, despite it, being justified, because it could drive, that need to look out for oneself as well. So yeah, any more comments on terminology that's being used? That would be great to hear as well. So I might move on to Sharon as well now, just because I'm conscious of her time and needing to step away as she has. But Sharon, can we talk, because the next part of the conversation, we want to move on to what is being done and what can be done.
Yes.
About this in the past session. But I love some of the work that's going on from the Pacific. Action, particularly around the Women Weather Watch.
Great, yes. So the first thing I want to say is, Women's Weather Watch came about in Fiji because of an approach we started taking in my previous role with FemLink Pacific in initiating the establishment of a women-led community media organization. And that basically came about because, as someone who had been working in broadcasting, in particular in the mainstream media, I didn't hear the voices of women, or you had to sort of justify, in a special women's program to try and compact everything in terms of women's realities. We take a appropriate and accessible technology approach. So I have to say, it's not much on the internet, but it's more about the use of radio. It's about the use of technology that works for women. And that's how the SMS technology came about, because it was a way to be able to quickly get information out to women, particularly in rural communities, that translated for them the climate science or the climate information, the weather information, in a way that connected with their lives, and in a way that didn't have to have them rely on having access to data or even having credit in their mobile phones. So Women's Weather Watch, over time has evolved, but I'm just in awe of my sisters in ActionAid Vanuatu and Women Talk Together, who, as a result of just a couple of workshops between November 2018 and June 2019, picked up on this whole idea of how, first and foremost, that part of an empowerment process, that access to information on weather information, climate services, is part of that leadership role that women play. And that here was an opportunity for them to overcome these barriers in decision making, and then to be able to use Women Wet and Weather, as it's known in Vanuatu, to be able to share information to women in their communities. But what is also different for us is, as we challenge the status quo in terms of content that's available, to also give women the opportunity in local communities to share information back up into the policy and media spaces. And we saw that happen with women on television, talking about their issues, women on the radio. And then, of course, as the COVID-19 pandemic, started to rise in March, and as women were preparing for TC Harold, to see the way in which Women, Wet and Weather were able to reach 77,000 people in Vanuatu to help them prepare for the COVID crisis, and then immediately continue to engage around the issues to do with preparedness and response with TC Harold. So for me, it's about, looking at the availability of media, information, communication technology, and making it more just. I think that is it, so in terms of a gender just perspective, climate justice, I believe, can work. Just as we get used to the language of climate security, I think it is the language that comes from communities and from our activism, which is actually linked to our daily lived realities, that we need to be amplifying. I'll pause there, Angela.
Yeah, it's amazing. And it gets, I think I saw in your video note as well that it's translated into hundreds of languages. Is that correct, Sharon? When you go across the Pacific, it does end up getting...
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I was recently on a panel with UNESCO where we talked about reaching the unreached, and I guess sometimes the media is also the unreachable. But I think that what is important is that as we work as Shifting the Power Coalition across 6 Pacific Island countries, we're reminded, for example, in Papua New Guinea, they have 800 local languages. And then we're working with women in Bougainville, for example, in islands that are off the beaten track, literally, because they don't have access to mobile phone technology, let alone information communication. So it's been really important for us to think about ways in which information and communication reaches us, which, us as in the capital cities. Fiji is an important regional hub, including for Australia. But also, how do we get that information from women who, for Bougainville in particular, the Carteret Islands, the work has been going on for more than 20, 30 years around displacement. So it's really important to hear from these women and to be able to share their stories and insights into what is, a major political issue for our region right now, migration and relocation. Thank you, Angela.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you so much. So, Sharon, if you do need to go, understand, if you do, we might have some questions come up, but I'll leave it with you about how you can participate. And I'm sure that if any questions also come up that you can't get to, we can get them answered post this conversation. And I think Michelle might also have some details of how it's all working there as well. So just a few more questions from me to our panel, and then we have got lots of great comments coming in. So I want to get to some of those, and also any other Q&As. It'd be great to put the Q&A, any questions in the Q&A box. It just makes it a little bit easier to follow. We've got some in there already. So Denise, I want to go to you now. What do you think can be done to address the spread of fake news and misinformation in Australia? And how can we use technology here to enable that?
First of all, that was really inspirational, Sharon. So thank you. That was really interesting. I'd certainly here in Australia like to see more powers given to bodies such as the Press Council in regard to fake news. Right now, they don't seem to have a lot of regulations in regard to the consequences for media that actually publishes and distributes this kind of content. Rules around truth in political advertising, I think, would also be a good idea. I know there is some conversation by various politicians about that. I think Australians would be horrified to know that political parties can lie to us in their political advertising, unlike a lot of businesses. I think social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and so on, should also really step up in regard to the information that their users are placing on their platforms. I think we're seeing that more and more now with COVID, where some of the digital platforms are stepping in regard to fake news around that. I very much think that they should also be stepping up in regard to climate change. And it's not about it's not about an issue of free speech. It's just ensuring that surely we should be speaking about these issues based on facts and based on science. Because I think that that's also obviously having really dire consequences on how people are thinking about these sort of issues. In my own industry, so the advertising, marketing, media industry, advertisers are taking more responsibility about the content that they're aligning their ads to, and indeed funding through their advertising dollars. And they're really making decisions about not wanting to align their advertising to climate change denialist content. There is organisations popping up such as Comms Declare that is asking marketers and people working in the communications industry not to work with clients or businesses and organisations that promote fossil fuels. So there's a range of different things that I think we can be looking at. Superannuation, be more conscious about where your superannuation money is being funded. Be smarter in the way that you're investing your money, and be smarter in terms of the way that, in what products you're buying. But very much, again, I think it's time that the social media platforms really stepped into this space a lot more seriously.
Do you think there's been much of a shift there, Denise, in terms of some of the works?
I'd like to see more. I think COVID has again been a good example of what they can do. I'd certainly like to see them start to move into the climate change space as well. Yeah. I mean, we've seen Twitter do a couple of things with some of President Trump's tweets, but I haven't actually seen anything on climate. That was all to do with misinformation around COVID. Which again, you know, there are learnings out of COVID that hopefully we can apply when we talk about climate as well. Exactly.
Belinda, what do you think can be done to shift people's mindsets towards, I guess, recognising this is a very real issue and a very real threat?
Yeah, so I might answer that question by coming back to the research project I mentioned before. So, and thinking of the three biggest influences on the extent to which people recognise the real threat of climate change. So as I mentioned before, the most important factor was how people feel broadly. So what that means for all of us is that we can share emotional stories, really explaining to others why you care about climate change and why it worries you can help other people accept that it is a real threat. So the second factor was then the belief in those misinformation statements about how sort of harmful climate action might be or how unnecessary it is. I think the counterbalance there is to emphasize solutions and feasibility. So we can say that fossil fuels belong in the past, we shouldn't stick with gas, but we also need to explain like how cheap solar energy is, how many jobs are in the renewable industry, and even on an individual basis, doing things like making it really clear to people how they can switch their super funds, how they can compost food scraps, how they can eat less meat. We just need to make the solutions easier so climate change doesn't seem like a problem that's too scary or big to solve. And then the third factor that I hadn't already mentioned was social norms actually turned out to be the third most important factor. So social norms are the way that the people around you are acting and thinking, and that can influence the way that you act and think. Either because you want to be liked by them and accepted by them, or because the fact that they're acting and thinking that way suggests that that's the correct way to act and think. So what that means for all of us is that we potentially each have a lot of power and influence on the people around us. The way that we act and the way that we encourage our friends and family and colleagues to act can really shift their own behaviour more than experiencing a bushfire firsthand, for example. So the other good thing about social norms is that we know in Australia that the majority of Australians say that they care about climate and that they want more action. So if the people who say that were to all speak up, we could potentially overwhelm the misinformation and the false narratives that are out there with our own stories about why we care and what the solutions are.
Okay, I might do a plug out for Rebecca Huntley's book now. I think somebody else mentioned it in the Q&A as well. I believe it's How to Talk About Climate Change in a Way That Makes a Difference. It's really good. It does provide a guide to how to have these conversations, really. I think particularly as we start to come out of lockdown situations, we might be in a position where we can actually have more conversations face to face. And as we enter the holiday period and that kind of thing, it might be a good thing to check out. You mentioned there, and I think this is a really interesting point of where misinformation can come through, is around the cost of action. And particularly we look at like the cost of solar and wind, and it can be often, when we associate the cost of that, the prices of that, we're looking at information from a decade ago, 15 years ago, and we fail to kind of consider the advances in technology that have occurred since then, and the advances of technology we can very easily predict should occur quite very soon as well. So Marcus here has a question if possible, thinking about Susan Blackmore's meme machine, is it simply that misinformation as a simple and compelling hit is better at being spread? Does real formation need to find a way to compete at that level of simplicity? Now, Marcus, I don't know if you came up with the term real formation. It's great. It's kind of sad that we need an additional word for information. We should be able to just rely on the facts, but real formation. Denise, Belinda, either of you want to have a go at that question?
Well, I'll say that I think, again, in Australia that we've got challenges in terms of the channels where real formation, good word, can reach, particularly again through our mainstream media landscape. We're challenged. Some in our mainstream media it's not in their interests for Australians to see factual information about climate change. I think that that's such a major challenge. It's almost like we have to work around the mainstream. And that's, again, where social media can be useful. But again, there are challenges with social media, and how do you navigate to find truthful information on social media, because there's certainly a lot of misinformation as well.
Okay. All right. So another question here, going back to social media, I guess, from Christine. How can we be sure the information sourced from Twitter is accurate, given there is a great deal on there that is biased? Do you have any, maybe to you again, Denise, do you have any thoughts about that, or any tips or anything that you do to really make sure that what you're following and what you're sourcing is correct?
There are an enormous amount of academics and subject matter experts on everything that you can possibly think of on Twitter. I'm incredibly careful how I curate the information that I see on Twitter. I have a mantra that I block early and block often, in terms of if someone's a troll or abusive or anything like that. I follow the Ozpol hashtag on Twitter. Now, that's a unique hashtag and a unique community in the world in regard to Twitter. It's very active. It's the most retweeted hashtag in Australia. It's one of the most retweeted political hashtags in the world by far. It is a community of well-informed, politically interested Australians. If I got on there and started talking about arson and misinformation about climate change, my community would soon pull me into line. So I would certainly recommend that you follow some trusted scientists and some trusted Twitter users, and start to form your community around there. There are also a range of climate change community-led organisations that tweet out an awful lot of information about climate change on a more than daily basis that are really interesting to follow. Again, look at who's following them, who's retweeting them, to start to curate your community. But yeah, look, it takes time to curate the people you should be following on Twitter, but I can guarantee you the rewards are certainly there. And again, to me, that mismatch between what I see in the mainstream compared to what I see through a curated social media community are very strong.
I think I remember hearing from Twitter, it was a few years ago, that Ozpol, the hashtag, was, I think it was the largest hashtag in the world, or is that still the case? I can't remember the word that they use, but is that still the case?
It's certainly the most retweeted hashtag in Australia by far, and consistently retweeted hashtag. It is also one of the most retweeted political hashtags in the world. Now, yes, there's a lot of volatility going on in the US and the UK, so there's a lot going on in Twitter. Donald Trump has certainly changed the nature of Twitter, particularly lately, particularly today, don't get me started. But yes, it's a very active and quite renowned community where a lot of people, ordinary mud punters like me, are in there talking about politics a lot, but again, come back to the experts and the academics that are using Twitter to get information out almost in real time as well. You can tap directly into speeches, into press conferences, into research studies through Twitter. I think too, it's no wonder to me that some in the mainstream try to undermine Twitter, because there is a really strong community of people that are interested in facts, and that are interested in facts on all kinds of issues, climate change, of course, being one of those issues.
I might just add one little point as well regarding something that I do, at least, and you've just reminded me of it, Denise, because you mentioned today Donald Trump has just tweeted something that's just disgusting and irresponsible, and it really does show that, you know, even so-called elected official, and we have to think about this in Australia too. You can't necessarily take what they're saying as words. So one thing, I mean, it's not so much in terms of Donald Trump's particular tweet, which just kind of, if you look at the replies on that, it does carry a lot of abuse towards him. But, you know, if you do see a political leader in Australia make a comment about climate change, I always think it's a good idea to go and just have a look at some of the responses, because you do actually come across some of those academics and some of those experts, and you can look for particular people who have specific expertise, and they can often give really good, considered, well thought out responses to what's being said, and it is worthwhile doing that. So a few more questions. So we've gotten to, okay, so we are running out of time, so we've got 5 more minutes, so it might be time just to sum up. Thank you so much, Denise. Thank you so much, Belinda. And I think Michelle is still on the line somewhere, and she will close the session. Michelle, I did lose track of time there. So
that's fine. I think it's been a fantastic discussion, and I mean, we've definitely had a lot of comments through the chat and questions, and obviously, really, I think everyone's grappling with this issue about how do you actually drive greater climate action at the same time as, you know, balancing the need to really show that, you know, the threat of climate change is very real and pressing. And I can see there's a lot of discussion around, you know, what is the right pitch for that. And also, you know, potentially it lies much more on looking at different audiences and, you know, how do we respond and cater to the different audiences that are out there. But a big thank you to our 3 panelists today, Belinda and Denise. It's been fantastic to have you join us along with Sharon. As Angela mentioned, we will share a short video that Sharon prepared. She knew that there would be challenges in terms of coming into this conversation, given her location. So we'll circulate that after the call. Thank you so much, Angela. It's always great having you moderate and, you know, and also, you know, obviously infuse the discussion with, you know, your wealth of knowledge. But a big thank you, everyone, for joining us. We will circulate a list of, you know, relevant sources, trusted sources that can be useful for those looking to look at who to follow, where to get the right information. We can also share a link to Belinda's research. I see that was also requested. And if you'd like to know more information about either the Shifting the Power Coalition, which Sharon mentioned, or Women's Weather Watch, you know, both initiatives are supporting, you know, Pacific women to really drive action on climate change. You can visit the ActionAid website, actionaid.org.au. Both initiatives are supported through ActionAid's Arise Fund, which is supporting women on the front lines of the climate crisis to prepare, to respond, and also to protect their rights in emergencies. And you can find out more about that at arisefund.com. But look, thank you everyone for joining us. We hope to bring more of these speaker series to you. If you do have ideas on topics and issues that you'd like to for us to be discussing, please do get in touch and let us know. But thank you all for joining us, and have a great week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.